December 7th, 2009 began as one of those mundane winter days in West Valley City, Utah, which did not portend anything unusual. Snow slowly settled onto the streets, forming crisp layers on the sidewalks and roofs of houses. Residents of the city went about their business, preparing for the upcoming Christmas holidays. On this cold morning, the Powell family, consisting of Susan, her husband Joshua, and their two young sons, Charles and Braden, had to start their day as usual. Joshua, a 33-year-old man, an engineer by training, planned to go to work, and Susan planned to take care of the children by sending them to kindergarten. However, anxiety soon grew among Powell's family and acquaintances. Starting in the early morning, several people tried to contact the family, but no one answered. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Sometimes Joshua and Susan could be busy with their own business or forget their phones at home. However, by 9 a.m., Joshua had not shown up at work, which caused alarm among his colleagues. Susan, in turn, also did not show up at the meeting she had planned, and the children were never seen at the kindergarten. Susan's family began to feel vaguely uneasy when attempts to reach the family were unsuccessful. Closer to lunch, Susan's brother and sister, realizing that the situation was getting strange, began to call the police to find out if there had been any accident. They knew that Susan was a responsible person and the sudden disappearance was out of character for her. By lunchtime, it became clear that the day that started so normally had turned into a day of anxiety. When no one answered the phone, the relatives decided to visit the Powell house. However, upon arrival, they were met with frightening silence. The doors were locked. No one answered the bells. There were no signs of life in the house. By noon, Susan's family's anxiety had turned into a real panic. They kept calling Susan and Joshua's phones, but to no avail. It was obvious that something had gone wrong. In desperation, loved ones began to ponder the worst-case scenarios, including the possibility of an accident or accident. They have already started discussing with the police the possibility of breaking into the house to check if something terrible happened inside. In their opinion, Susan would never have left her children in danger or unattended for such a long time. The situation took a new turn around 5 o'clock in the evening, when suddenly Joshua appeared on the doorstep with their two children, Charles and Braden, in his arms. This moment should have been a relief for his family and friends, but their joy quickly turned to anxiety. Susan was not with them. When Joshua Powell returned home with his two young sons, about 5 o'clock in the evening, both alarmed relatives and police officers had already arrived at the scene, who began their investigation into the sudden disappearance of his wife, Susan. Despite the fact that Joshua claimed to have spent the day hiking with the children, and Susan, according to him, stayed at home, the situation seemed increasingly suspicious and strange to others. Joshua's story, in which he went on a night hike with young children in the middle of winter in sub-zero temperatures, raised many questions. However, the most worrying thing was that Susan, according to him, should have stayed at home, but there were no traces of her in the house. The police officers who arrived at the scene began with a simple inspection of the Powell family home. Everything looked calm from the outside. There were no signs of forced entry, the windows and doors were intact, and there was also nothing suspicious in the courtyard. However, inside the house, the painting began to raise more questions. The first thing that immediately caught the attention of the investigators was Susan's personal belongings left behind. On the kitchen table was her bag, which contained a purse with money and bank cards, car keys, and other small things that she usually carried with her. It is important to note that her mobile phone was also lying next to the bag, fully charged and turned on, which raised many questions from investigators. If Susan left the house voluntarily, why did she leave such important personal items? This immediately ruled out the possibility that the woman left the house on her own without warning either her husband or relatives. The abandoned phone especially alerted investigators. as it was her main way of communicating with her loved ones. When the police examined the kitchen, they also noticed several unnatural details. There was a pot of food on the stove, presumably cooked the night before. 2 children's plates with lunch for boys were laid out around the stove. However, it was obvious that no one sat down at the table to eat. It all looked as if the cooking of dinner had been interrupted at the very last moment. Either Susan was going to feed the children and something distracted her, or everything happened so suddenly that she did not even have time to start dinner. The next important piece of evidence was the sofa in the living room. The police immediately noticed that the sofa was partially wet, and there was a fan next to it, which was turned on and pointed directly at the wet spot. Joshua didn't seem to give it much thought, claiming that he was just cleaning the house. However, this explanation raised more questions than answers. Why exactly was the sofa so wet that it took a fan to dry it? If it was a routine cleaning, why such an urgent and thorough intervention? In addition, there was a strong smell of cleaning products in the room, as if the house had been treated with chemicals just a few hours ago. The police asked themselves the question, if Susan really stayed at home, why would she do such intensive cleaning late at night? The whole picture looked like someone was trying to hide the traces of some recent actions, possibly related to her disappearance. And despite the fact that outwardly everything in the house looked quite ordinary, these small but important details reinforced suspicions. The police decided to inspect other rooms, including the couple's bedroom. Here too, they found no obvious signs of a struggle or disorder. However, one more important detail attracted attention in the bedroom. Susan's bed looked as if no one had slept on it. Despite the fact that Joshua claimed to have left his wife asleep, her side of the bed was neatly made up, and there was no sign on the pillow that anyone had recently been lying there. This strongly contradicted the words of Joshua, who claimed that his wife was asleep when he left for a night hike. The situation became increasingly confusing, and the officers decided to proceed with a more thorough inspection of the house, including interviewing relatives and neighbors. First of all, they turned to Susan's relatives, who were on the spot and by that time had already expressed their dissatisfaction and growing suspicion of Joshua. The women's relatives told the police that there had been problems in the Powell family in recent months. The couple often quarreled, and the relationship between them became increasingly strained. Susan has repeatedly shared with her sister and close friends her fears and worries about her husband. Joshua, according to relatives, became more withdrawn and controlling, and also faced serious financial difficulties, which only increased conflicts in the family. One of the first real clues that could shed light on the events of that night was the discovery of her diary in Susan's house. The police seized it for further examination, believing that the personal records could contain important information about her last days and her relationship with Joshua. Flipping through the pages of the diary, the investigators soon found several disturbing entries. Susan described her state of anxiety and concern for the children, and expressed doubts about the future of their marriage. She wrote that she felt increasingly lonely and unhappy in a relationship, and that she was afraid of Joshua's possible reaction to their conflicts. These recordings only increased police suspicions, as they pointed to potential motives for the woman's disappearance. The neighbors also gave important testimony. One of the nearest neighbors said that on the night of December 6th to 7th, he saw a car leave the Powell house around 5 o'clock in the morning. He couldn't say for sure who was driving, but he was sure it was Joshua's car. This fact confirmed Joshua's own version of the night hike, but also raised new questions. Why did he choose such a strange moment to go to nature with young children? At this time of year, the temperature at night in the West Valley City area dropped below zero, and the idea of a night hike looked completely ridiculous and inexplicable. Other neighbors said that a few days before Susan disappeared, they heard loud arguments in the Powell house, but could not determine their nature. These statements only reinforced the assumption that there were serious conflicts in the family that could have caused her sudden disappearance. After receiving these statements, The police decided to continue the inspection in more detail, including paying attention to the garage. After examining the room, the investigators noticed another suspicious detail. A canister of gasoline and several empty boxes were found next to Joshua's car. This, in itself, did not seem to be something exceptional. However, in the context of the whole picture, investigators began to wonder, why did Joshua store gasoline in the garage if he was not in the habit of repairing cars? Despite all these suspicious details, key clues were still missing. Most importantly, there were no signs of violence or any evidence that Susan had been killed or abducted. However, this did not stop the police. To deepen the investigation, they invited criminologists to inspect the house in detail. First of all, they decided to study the sofa, which, as already noted, was dried by a fan. With the help of special chemical reagents capable of detecting traces of blood and other biological substances, the experts carefully examined the surface of the sofa and its upholstery. The results of the examination showed that there were indeed traces of blood on the sofa, although in small quantities. This immediately attracted the attention of investigators, although it was not yet a sufficient reason for Joshua's arrest. The experts continued their analysis, trying to identify additional traces that could give more information about what happened in the house. Samples of cleaning products used in the house were also collected for further analysis. At this stage, the investigation focused on trying to understand what happened on that ill-fated evening or night. It was clear that someone was trying to carefully cover up the tracks, possibly related to Susan's disappearance. The only question is how far these actions have gone, and what actually happened in the house on the night of December 7th. The discovery of traces of blood on the couch was the first alarm signal, but it was not enough to charge Joshua Powell. The investigation needed additional evidence, and the police continued to gather information to solve the mystery of Susan's disappearance. The key focus was the study of the family's financial documents. The officers drew attention to the recently issued large life insurance for Susan. The policy, issued just a few months before her disappearance, was worth $1.5 million, which immediately attracted the attention of investigators. Moreover, Joshua Powell was listed as the beneficiary of the insurance. An insurance policy of this magnitude could not be an accident, especially against the background of the disappearance of a woman. The police began to suspect that this could be part of an elaborate plan. Further financial research revealed that Joshua Powell had been experiencing serious financial difficulties in recent months. He accumulated debts and faced the inability to repay them, which added tension to his family relations. Susan's relatives said that there were often quarrels between the couple, especially against the background of financial problems that Joshua tried to hide from others. All these facts allowed the police to build a theory that Susan's disappearance could be connected with his attempts to get rid of debts with the help of insurance. Soon, the police made another important discovery, which added a new serious thread to the investigation. During a search of the house, a handwritten note written by Susan shortly before her disappearance was discovered. In this letter, she clearly expressed her fears for her own safety. Susan described in detail her state of fear and anxiety due to Joshua's behavior. In the letter, she said that she was afraid for her life and felt that her husband was becoming more aggressive. This letter, written by Susan, became the most important evidence of her inner state before her disappearance and proof that she had a premonition of a possible threat from her husband. This discovery was a turning point in the investigation. Now the investigators could present a clearer picture of what was happening. Susan was aware that her marriage was bursting at the seams and clearly feared for her life. Her fears were not empty. She even planned to seek legal help, and her friends confirmed that Susan was seriously considering a divorce, although she was afraid of Joshua's anger. With the letter and the insurance policy in hand, the investigation began to focus on Joshua as the main suspect, but that alone was not enough to charge. the police needed even more evidence to confirm the theory that Susan had not just disappeared, but had become the victim of an elaborate crime. Investigators continued to examine data on Joshua's movements on the night of her disappearance, based on the analysis of his mobile phone signals and information from surveillance cameras. They were able to reconstruct the approximate route of his movements. Although Joshua claimed to have spent time camping with the kids, the mobile data pointed to something else. Investigators found out that that night, Joshua drove to places far from the alleged recreation area. These locations included abandoned plots of land that were not popular with tourists or vacationers. One of these places turned out to be in a deserted part of the county, where ordinary cars rarely entered, especially in winter. This route was very different from Joshua's story of a family camping trip. One of the most important steps in the investigation was the study of Joshua's car itself. The police conducted a thorough inspection of his minivan, which he used for his hike. When the forensics team examined the car, they found several important clues that increased suspicions about Joshua. Traces of fresh earth were found in the trunk of the minivan, indicating that the car could have been used in a wooded or desert area. However, Joshua could not provide a clear explanation as to where they were that day. The strangest find was the gasoline stains, which were also found in the trunk. Joshua explained this by saying that he wanted to refuel in case there were difficulties on the road, but the police could not help but wonder, why take a canister of gasoline with him if there were gas stations near the house? In addition, investigators found several blankets in the car that seemed suspiciously clean for the alleged camping trip. There were no signs that the children had actually been out for a walk. No dirt, no wet footprints. At this stage, the investigation also began to closely examine the behavior of Joshua himself after the disappearance of his wife. Despite the fact that he claimed to be very worried about her disappearance, his actions contradicted these words. For example, he did not immediately report her disappearance, which aroused suspicion among investigators and relatives. In addition, his strange isolation, disinterest in the search, and attempts to avoid communicating with the police were additional factors that increased suspicion. In addition, investigators found traces on Joshua's computer that he was planning to escape. He was interested in international visas and was looking for information on how to leave the country, which indicated a possible attempt to hide after receiving an insurance payment. This data reinforced the investigators' suspicions and confirmed that Joshua had carefully thought through every step. Soon I managed to talk to one of Susan's sons. Charlie, the Powell's eldest son, later said that his mother also went camping with them, but was tired and rode in the trunk. And Mom also decided to stay in the mountains because it was very beautiful there. The evidence gathered began to add up to the big picture: the $1.5 million insurance, the son's story, Susan's letter with fears for her life, the blood traces found, and suspicious financial and digital data. All this pointed to Joshua as the main suspect. The police were sure that he was not only hiding the truth about what had happened, but also, most likely, carefully planned this crime. At this stage, public attention to the case began to grow. The press covered every step of the investigation, and the public closely followed the developments. The case of Susan Powell's disappearance became one of the main topics in the Utah news, and later on the national level. People wondered how a young mother of two could have disappeared, and why her husband was acting so suspiciously. Public opinion was increasingly inclined to believe that Joshua was guilty, and people demanded justice. The investigators, confident in their version, began to prepare for the next step: the official accusation of Joshua's involvement in the disappearance of his wife. But new challenges awaited them ahead, as the case turned out to be more difficult than they could have imagined. Despite the abundance of circumstantial evidence and suspicious facts accumulated by the investigation, the police still faced serious difficulties in formally charging Joshua Powell. He continued to remain at large, although public opinion was already leaning towards his guilt. The investigators, realizing that the evidence gathered is not yet enough to arrest have intensified surveillance of Joshua and his behavior. They knew that a key piece of evidence or a wrong action on the part of the suspect could shed light on his role in Susan's disappearance. Amid mounting media pressure, as well as desperate attempts by Susan's relatives to get justice, the investigation focused on finding additional evidence. The woman's relatives, having not waited for significant progress from the police, began to organize independent searches and turn to the media, hoping to attract even more attention to the case. They did not give up trying to find out the truth about Susan's fate and help the investigation in any way possible. Meanwhile, investigators continued to analyze Joshua's behavior in detail. His actions became increasingly strange and unpredictable. Despite the attention from the police and the public, he seemed increasingly detached from the lives of his children and family responsibilities. It was subsequently revealed that he had started selling the family's personal belongings, including furniture and household appliances, which only increased suspicions that he was planning to leave the city, or even the country. This attracted the attention of the police, and they began actively monitoring his financial activities. During a more detailed analysis of the data from his mobile phone, it became clear that he had made several trips to remote areas of the state, which did not correspond to his original version of a family hike. This data led investigators to specific locations, remote and sparsely populated, in which Joshua could probably be trying to hide evidence. The police immediately began organizing searches in these areas. Large-scale operations were launched with the involvement of criminologists, dogs, and volunteers to examine the alleged sites. It was difficult. The terrain turned out to be impassable, and due to the winter weather, the search was very difficult. However, the efforts of the police and volunteers began to bear fruit. In one of the surveyed areas, where GPS data indicated an abandoned quarry was discovered, which seemed suspicious to investigators. The task force immediately began a search of the place. Although no direct traces of Susan were found there, experts noted the presence of several unusual objects, fragments of tissue that were sent for examination. The fabric turned out to be similar to the one worn by Susan the last time, according to the testimony of her relatives and friends. Although this piece of evidence was insufficient for a direct charge, it became another important link in the case, confirming that Joshua visited this place on the day of his wife's disappearance. Realizing that the evidence against him was accumulating, Joshua began to behave even more strangely. He did not try to actively participate in the search for his wife and continued to refuse to communicate with the press and the police. However, the investigators knew that they were getting closer to solving the case. The breakthrough came when the police received permission for an additional search of Joshua's house and car. Soon, the police were able to find additional traces of ash and soot in the trunk of the car. These materials were sent for examination, which showed that they could be a consequence of the destruction of evidence. This discovery was the last straw. The police could no longer ignore the facts. Joshua was clearly trying to hide the evidence, and his involvement in his wife's disappearance became almost obvious. Investigators have drawn up a warrant for his arrest based on the evidence gathered and the testimony of witnesses. Joshua's arrest occurred early in the morning when he was at home with the children. The police broke into the house, took him into custody, and charged him with involvement in the disappearance of Susan Powell. During the arrest, Joshua did not resist, but also showed no signs of remorse or surprise. He seemed to be ready for this moment, which only strengthened the suspicions of the investigators. After the arrest, a new phase of the investigation began. The police began to carefully analyze all the evidence to prepare the case for trial. Joshua, despite the charges, continued to deny his guilt. He claimed that he had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance and insisted that she had left the house of her own accord. However, enough evidence was gathered against him to start a trial. At that moment, the society was following every step of the case. Joshua's arrest caused a huge response, many people, especially Susan's relatives, finally saw the first real step towards justice. However, the case has not been completed yet. There were long trials ahead, and the police needed to prove that Joshua was not just hiding the truth, but was really involved in his wife's disappearance. Court sessions were scheduled for the end of 2010. The prosecution was set up for a long and difficult trial. Prosecutors, realizing that they would have to prove Joshua's guilt without the main evidence, Susan's body, focused on creating a holistic picture of how and why Joshua could have committed this crime. The prosecution built its case around Joshua's motives related to financial problems and his desire to receive $1.5 million in life insurance for Susan. They presented circumstantial evidence, traces of blood in the house, a letter from Susan expressing fear for her life, and Joshua's search queries about methods of hiding the body. These clues created a complete picture of the planned crime. The defense, in turn, insisted that the absence of a body made it impossible to say with certainty that Susan was dead, and that the prosecution was based on assumptions. The lawyers tried to prove that Susan could have left the house of her own free will. The hearings lasted several weeks, during which both sides presented their arguments. Prosecutors focused on Joshua's strange behavior after his wife disappeared and his attempts to conceal evidence. They insisted that there was enough evidence to convict him of murder. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Joshua Powell was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the right to early release. The prosecution won, despite the absence of a body, relying on carefully collected circumstantial evidence, and Susan's relatives, although they did not find out the whole truth, finally received at least partial satisfaction in justice. The Susan Powell case has become one of the most tragic and mysterious stories that have shaken society. The disappearance of the mother of 2 children, the suspicions against her husband, and the subsequent trial left a deep mark on the memory not only of her family but also of the whole country. Despite the absence of a body, investigators were able to gather enough circumstantial evidence to charge Joshua Powell with murder. This case has demonstrated how important it is to respond in time to signs of family conflicts and violence that can escalate into tragedies. Susan's letter, her fears, and attempts to protect herself, unfortunately, were not noticed in time, which became a terrible reminder of the need for more active intervention from social services and law enforcement agencies. Although Joshua Powell was found guilty and convicted, the final truth about what happened to Susan has remained unknown. Her body has never been found, leaving her family and friends in a state of constant pain and uncertainty. The tragedy of the Powell family is not only a story about a lost life, but also an important lesson for the whole society about how family conflicts can lead to irreversible consequences if they are not recognized and prevented in time.